So today I'd like to talk about the night that Manoa Stream flooded and how it impacted the University of Hawaii, and in particular the University of Hawaii library. Saturday, October 30th, 2004, Hamilton Library on the campus of the University of Hawaii at Manoa was damaged by a flash flood. 10 inches of rain fell in Manoa Valley, causing Manoa Stream to overflow its banks. This is basically a graphic showing how that water flowed through campus. The water damaged 120 homes and several buildings on campus. It washed out bridges, washed cars into trees, and pushed a large amount of debris over the landscape. The image on the bottom, you can see all this wood that's caught in a chain link fence as this basically wall of water washed over the land. Total damage was estimated at $85 million for this flood. This slide shows the height of the water in the loading dock. This is on the Mauka side, or the mountain side of the library. So you can see, I don't know if they can see it there. Basically, up above that yellow band where the water level was. This is also on the Mauka side of the building, and so the loading dock is to the right-hand side. The library was designed with a dry moat around 1/3 of the building to allow light to reach the basement. The moat is located between the railing and the building. The water filled the moat until the pressure got so great that it tore an emergency door from the hinges and rushed into the building. The water reached 8 feet inside the building. It destroyed the staff lounge, technical services, the map department, government documents, the server room, and the LIS classrooms. So inside the building, these are images of the damage the day after the flood went through. You can see the direction of the water flow as it pushed over the shelving, filling all of the map cases full of mud, and really causing, obviously extensive damage. I included this image because I was one of the few people in the building when this was happening, and as I was leaving, at one point I was standing at the top of the stairway looking down. I could just see the beginning of some water, and for a moment I considered going down to investigate. Fortunately, I chose not to. There was also a class being taught that night. This is the window that they broke as they escaped. The classroom was on the opposite side of the building from the moat. This is known as the Makai side, which is basically the ocean side. You can see the collection stuck in the window because this is how the water ended up exiting the building. So week 1, the first day after the flood, a plan was defined and priorities assigned. All staff and volunteers worked to salvage materials, primarily under the direction of the preservation librarian. This was fluid over the coming week, and it changed as the situation was reevaluated. The disaster plan was never designed to deal with a flood of this magnitude, although looking back it should have. If a threats assessment would have been conducted, as we had talked about earlier, with this program, it would have been discovered that the library was built in a floodplain, and perhaps measures could have been taken to prevent this disaster. So this is just showing some of the recovery activities. At one point we started washing photographs, separating them and hanging them up to dry. Eventually there was just too many of them, so they were boxed up and frozen for later recovery work. Computers were salvaged and washed outside. The server room that held the cataloging system was also in the basement, and that was completely destroyed. Fortunately, there were backup tapes, so much of that could be reconstructed afterwards. So this is an image of, you can see the operation that was happening outside the building as people were packing out government documents from inside the building, removing them from the shelves, putting them in boxes, basically in an assembly line, and then packing them into, or loading them into a freezer truck. These were later sent to Texas, the Belfour facility for vacuum freeze drying. This is showing the removal of the map drawers. So all these map drawers were full of mud. There was really no way to remove the maps at that time because they were, wet and just too fragile. So the drawers were removed, and these two were staged and then loaded in directly into a freezer truck. The higher priority, or the more important maps, were kept there in Hawaii in a freezer facility for recovery work in the library, and the lower priority were sent to Texas as well for recovery work there. The building was stabilized by BMS CAT, and so shortly after the disaster happened, we started getting phone calls from disaster recovery companies, that wanted the business, obviously. And so here it's just showing, they're basically desiccant dryers that pump the air through the building to help dehumidify and stabilize the building, because all of the power was knocked out and there was obviously no air conditioning system. So this was taken on the front steps of the library, so it basically helped document, the people that were there working on this recovery effort. And these are really the people that had their lives turned upside down that night and had their jobs completely reassigned as they, went from, serving the public to trying to recover their own materials. So during week 2, everything that had been, or that we could salvage, was basically salvaged at that point. The people were burned out. The crisis centers were open to help people with stress. A contract was signed with Belfour at that time to remove everything that was left in the basement and clean the space. The mold grew out to about 9 inches on the remaining materials on the walls. The laborers that were hired, basically they hired day laborers to come in and clear this out, had to wear hazmat suits. And this is showing, bags of books and documents as they're heading for the dumpster. It took 5 months to open the library to patrons. Even then, the building was still under diesel generator power, lights strung in the hallways, the air being blown into the building through the plastic tubes. The fire suppression system was not functioning, but the fire inspectors had signed off. As long as certain precautions, additional fire extinguishers were put in the building. People couldn't be in there after dark. And this worked fine for about 10 days. At that time, an arsonist started setting fires. We assumed that the building, or the library, became a high-profile target after it was publicly announced that the suppression system was not functioning. Although the damage was not extensive, the arsonist was never caught, and it was, just one more thing to deal with as we were trying to move forward. After 1 year, the power was restored to the building. They were finally able to remove the diesel generators from outside the building. One of the downsides to having these out there was it was near an intake vent for a different part of the library, so we were actually getting diesel particulate into that building. Once it was identified, they were able to change that, but it's just, you just never know. It's how one thing leads to another to another. And like I said, it's just a very fluid process. So 6 years, it took 6 years for the basement to be rebuilt. The cost of the library was $39 million. FEMA reimbursed the library for about $21 million. Of course, that's when the politicians show up. So we have, I believe it's the governor, the head of the library. All these events are blessed by a priest in Hawaii, and then the chancellor. The library has a beautiful new space. I'd say far better than what was lost to the flood. So it really gave the library an opportunity to improve. Granted, some unique items were lost, but fortunately no lives. It is likely people would have died if this would happen during the workday. The basement would have been full of employees and patrons, and when the water rushed in, there would really have been no escape. So we're very fortunate that it happened on a Saturday night and the building was minimally occupied. The moat has been filled and the library is looking towards the future. This was a learning experience for everyone. It certainly changed my life and how I look at disasters and disaster planning. Thank you.
This is Miriam's voice. Scott, that's an amazing story. Let me just ask if anybody has a question or two. There'll be more time for questions after Victoria's presentation, but let me just ask if anybody has a question before we move on to Victoria. Scott, a question we have here in Tampa is, what percentage of the collection was lost in a just very rough kind of number?
Once upon a time I knew that answer, but I really don't remember at this point. The majority of the government documents were lost. A large percentage of the maps were actually recovered, and I believe that was in the 200,000 to 300,000. But at a certain point it was decided that the maps were certainly a higher priority than the government documents, as well as photographs. So, basically you have such a limited amount of time as you're trying to pull this material out. So as a percentage, I can't really say.
Scott, I think I'm hearing a really important message in your answer, which is that you had to do a triage and you had to do it really fast. And I'm underscoring that because I know, as I have talked to many of you, there has been real discussion of, I don't want to set priorities. Everything in my collection is important. And I think we've just heard a very real story about why having thought through some of those issues ahead of time will actually help you preserve more collections, because you can get to work much more quickly than if you've not had the conversations ahead of time. And I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Scott, or if there are any other questions from anybody else.
Well, I don't have anything to add, but I do see there's a question from Gainesville regarding the failure of the moat. I really don't think that anybody ever, it was simply a way to get light down there, to that level. So I really don't think, it was designed as a dry moat, more or less, simply for lighting. So I don't think there was ever any consideration as to how that might handle a large influx of water. As well as the scale of that water coming down. It was described as being a 4-foot wall of water, just washing over the landscape. So, I don't think that was really ever considered.
Scott, I see that Tiffany and the folks in Tallahassee are also asking if any additional measures have been taken to prevent flooding in addition to filling the moat. Yeah, they're actually taking place at the city and state level. One of the problems was with the stream itself. A lot of debris had been
in Manoa Stream, so a lot of wood. And what happened as the water came down, it pushed that debris up against a bridge, and that's what ultimately caused it to jump the banks. And so there's actually an active cleaning process where they've removed a lot of that debris from the stream, and I believe there's actually a dredging process that's happening underneath some of the bridges to improve the water flow. And so it's really nothing that the library can do. We can't really move the building, that sort of thing. So there's, I think, a real reliance on working with the state. It's recognized that this is a problem and that it needs to be resolved. And so I think, the disaster did bring light to that issue. I guess I can address the question about why did it take a year to get the power back on. I believe part of it had to do with the electrical system, and they basically had to do rewiring. It was an older system. The water coming in there somehow fused the wires. The process, we were certainly very frustrated that it took that long because all the other buildings were actually brought back online much quicker. And so it really did feel like the library was being, left behind in some, or even underappreciated at some points. But I believe it had to do with the way that the electrical system was run. There's actually, below the basement, there's actually a sub-basement in this building, and that sub-basement also contained some wiring, and that was completely filled with water. It had to be pumped out. So there were multiple levels of problems with why they couldn't get it back online. At one point, also, because mold had gotten up into the ventilation systems, we had to have the entire vent system cleaned. There's many things that I couldn't touch on just because of the limited amount of time, but I hope that answers your question.